dear guests, dear Christina Morina, dear Saul Friedländer, Norbert Frei, and David Kim. Together with my colleagues, Director Oliver Hartmann and Project Coordinator Negar Bagheri, I would like to warmly welcome you all to the living room of the Thomas Mann House for tonight's lecture and conversation on bystanding and the Holocaust in Europe. It's an honor to have such a magnificent group of speakers here at the house tonight. Thank you so much. For those of you who are here for the first time, my name is Benno Herz. I am the program director of the Thomas Mann House, which is the former exile home of the German writer and Nobel laureate Thomas Mann. Mann lived here in this house with his family from 1942 to 52, having migrated here after fleeing Nazi Germany. At this time, the west side of Los Angeles, and specifically this neighborhood of Pacific Palisades, was teeming with other European emigres and exiles, such as the philosophers Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer, composer Alma Mahler-Werfel, writer Leon Feuchtwanger, Vicky Baum, and of course composer Arnold Schönberg, just to name a few. These artists, writers, and intellectuals would go on to forever change the cultural landscape of this city. And building on that legacy and history of exile, our house, as well as our sister institution Villa Aurora, today host fellowship programs for artists and intellectuals that aim to create a space for transatlantic debate, conversations, and events. When renowned historian Norbert Frei contacted me last March about the opportunity to organize this event, no one, of course, could have anticipated the horrible attacks on Israel on October 7 and the unimaginable suffering it caused that day and over the last weeks to civilians, and crucial for our discussion today, the rise in anti-Semitism and the threat to Jewish life worldwide. We, as an institution that is inextricably linked to war and seeking refuge, are very concerned about these developments, and it makes it even more important for us to have conversations such as the one taking place here tonight in our space. Before we dive into the lecture and conversation, I would like to acknowledge some special guests tonight. Joining us from Berlin is Marianne Heuwagen, our deputy chairwoman who has been passionately involved with Villa Aurora and Thomas Mann House since the beginning of the residency programs. Markus Klimmer, our Berlin-based chairman of the board of directors, who has been the driving force behind the Thomas Mann House and its reopening as a residency center in 2016. Jakob Scherer, our executive director, who is leading both houses with great wit and passion from our Berlin headquarters. And of course, Claudia Gordon, director of Villa Aurora and our dear colleague here in Los Angeles. I would also like to use this opportunity to briefly point out that we're in the presence of some other notable guests tonight. Would like to warmly welcome the Schönberg family, Barbara Zeisel-Schönberg and Ronald Schönberg, as well as Randy Schönberg. Thank you very much for joining us. With us tonight are also our current fellows in residence, media studies scholar and curator Sophie Charlotte Oppitz, and journalist René Agiga, the head of the literature department at Deutschlandfunk and Deutschlandfunk Kultur Radio. I now have the pleasure of introducing David Kim, who will then introduce tonight's speakers and Christina Morina's lecture. David Kim is professor in the Department of European Languages and Transcultural Studies at UCLA, as well as the associate vice provost of UCLA's International Institute. His scholarly interests range from post-colonial global and migration studies and community engagement to human rights, cosmopolitanism, cultural and political theories, global literary histories, and digital humanities. His first monograph is titled Cosmopolitan Parables, Trauma and Responsibility in Contemporary Germany, and his several edited volumes include, among others, Reframing Post-Colonial Studies and Imagining Human Rights. His peer-reviewed articles have recently appeared in leading journals such as the German Quarterly and the Journal of Translation Studies. David is also currently completing his new book on the concept of solidarity in the works of political theorist Hannah Arendt. We at the Thomas Mann House had the huge pleasure of collaborating with David on many occasions, from a community-engaged seminar on new approaches to transatlantic studies taught between UCLA and the Thomas Mann House, to many panel discussions on a range of topics, to his contribution to our volume, Thomas Mann's Los Angeles Stories from Exile. David, we are truly delighted to have you here tonight. Thank you. Last but not least, I would like to thank our co-sponsors and co-presenters for tonight's evening, Saul Friedländer's Balzan Prize, the German Research Foundation, and the University of Bielefeld. And of course, I'd like to thank my colleagues here at the House, Oliver Hartmann, Negar Bagheri, Katrin Klüppel, Carola Ammon, Pia Springsklee, and Betty Herrera. After the program, we will have snacks and drinks here on our patio and in the living room, so please feel free to join us after that. And I would kindly ask you to now turn off your phones because this event is being recorded. And with that, please welcome together with me David Kim, Christina Morina, Saul Friedländer, and Norbert Frei. Thank you, David.
I'd like to begin by thanking Benno Herz and the staff at the Thomas Mann House for hosting this very meaningful event. When Benno Herz invited me to introduce today's speakers and to moderate this conversation, I was thrilled for several reasons. First, it's always a wonderful experience, a great pleasure to work with the Thomas Mann House staff. During these challenging times, a sustained collaborative partnership between a university and civil society seems crucial for cultivating informed conversations about the many challenges that we're facing at local, national, and international scales. Our democracy needs difficult dialogues in these dark times. Second, I had the honor to meet Professors Frei and Friedländer at this very place in July 2019, and it's so wonderful to see both of you again. And third, today's main speaker is a brilliant historian whose books have taught me a lot about modern German and European histories, and I will introduce these distinguished historians in a minute. Last but not least, today's event is funded by several institutions, as Benno has mentioned, one of them being the Balzan Prize. Professors Frei and Friedländer will say more words about the prize, but when Benno approached me, I happened to be researching on the Balzan Prize. In the summer of 1963, Hannah Arendt was corresponding with philosopher Karl Jaspers and a Jewish South African writer by the name of Dan Jacobson about potential nominees for what was called back then the Balzan Prize for Humanity, Peace, and Fraternity among Peoples. Since its establishment in 1961, Karl Jaspers had been serving on the selection committee. Worried about interracial violence both in the United States and South Africa, shortly after the murder of Edgar Evers in Mississippi and the Sharpeville massacre to the south of Johannesburg, Arendt wanted Jaspers to nominate an anti-apartheid activist. Now, one of the names that was floated back then between Jacobson, Arendt, and Jaspers was Nelson Mandela. But in the end, they nominated someone else. And I was researching this fascinating yet unknown connection when I heard about Professor Morina's lecture funded by Professor Friedländer's Balzan Prize and also supported by Professor Frei. So I could not say no to Benno's invitation. Now, Professor Saul Friedländer hardly needs any introduction. He's an internationally renowned scholar of the Holocaust. Anyone who works in this vast, interdisciplinary, multinational field stands on Professor Friedländer's shoulders. He's currently Distinguished Professor Emeritus of History at UCLA. He's the recipient of numerous prizes, including the Israel Prize, the Geschwister Scholl Prize, and the 2009 American Historical Association Achievement Award for scholarly distinction, and obviously the Balzan Prize. He has published numerous books, too many to list here, but his latest book has just appeared with raving reviews in Germany. Blick in den Abgrund, ein israelisches Tagebuch. Gazing into the Abyss, an Israeli diary. Professor Norbert Frei is Senior Professor of Modern and Contemporary History at the University of Vienna and Director of the Jena Center of 20th Century History. He too is one of the renowned experts on the history and memory of World War II. He is the author of several magnificent books, and let me just mention two. Vergangenheitspolitik, die Anfänge der Bundesrepublik und die NS-Vergangenheit, 1996, and Im Namen der Deutschen, die Bundespräsidenten und die NS-Vergangenheit 1949 bis 1994, which has just appeared. And you can all watch his wonderful lecture given not too long ago on YouTube. So I highly recommend that. Last but not least, today's main speaker is Professor Christina Morina, who teaches contemporary history at the University of Bielefeld in Germany. She's the author and editor of several important books, the latest of which are Die Erfindung des Marxismus, The Invention of Marxism, and 1000 Aufbrüche, die Deutschen und ihre Demokratie seit den 1980er Jahren. The title of her lecture today is Bystanding and the Holocaust in Europe: Experiences, Ramifications, Representations, 1933 to the present. Professor Morina, Professor Frei, Professor Friedländer, all distinguished guests, welcome once again, and the floor is yours.
Before I begin, I would like to thank Benno Herz for his kind and wise guidance in preparing this event. Months before I arrived here, the spirit of the location touched me. Thank you and your colleagues for welcoming Saul Friedländer, Norbert Frei, and me here at the Thomas Mann House. When Thomas Mann, speaking at the Library of Congress only days after the end of World War II, referred to America as his new home, he called it a hospitable panopolis. This house, a rekindled place of intellectual and cultural exchange, really illustrates in new ways what he meant by that. Without the events of October 7th, I would have rooted this lecture firmly in the history and historiography of the Holocaust. But in light of the mass killings and kidnappings that took place in Israel on that day, and the war that is being fought in Gaza since, I feel it is impossible to go about this talk as if the themes it touches upon can be addressed in a business-as-usual manner. So I will not start with matters of history and historiography. Instead, I begin with a view at the present. I want to consider this present as a moment of a global, and to people living outside Israel and Palestine, a quasi-universal condition, a bystanding position. These days, not only here on the Pacific coast of the United States, most people probably think of themselves as some sort of bystander to the events unfolding in the Middle East. Yet we are not only witnesses to a seemingly distant conflict, but also to an extremely polarized public sphere on a national as well as a global level, and a widespread rise of anti-Semitism across the world. Coming from and speaking with an eye on Germany, issues of positionality are, and in my view, will always remain peculiar. It is a specifically formed position infused with the history and aftermath of Nazism and the genocidal anti-Semitism it unleashed across Germany and Europe between 1933 and 1945. Up until October 7th, even though anti-Semitism has not ended with the end of Nazism, its most violent expressions, pogroms, massacres, state-driven extermination, were thought to be threats of the past. When Saul Friedländer wrote in his seminal work, Nazi Germany and the Jews, that the so-called final solution was possible because of a deep-seated European anti-Semitic culture, he referred to horrors of history, a history that he and many others hoped and assumed was over once and for all with the defeat of Nazism. Yet, after October 7th, we have reason to fear that his insights have more to do with the present than any of us could have imagined. One of Saul's central conclusions was that, quote, the flames that the Nazi leaders set alight and fanned burned as widely and intensely as they did because the widespread anti-Semitism provided a dense underbrush of ideological and cultural elements ready to catch fire, end quote. Current events suggest, that this dense ideological and cultural underbrush still exists. Even worse, today it does not only exist on a European level, it has reached a global scale. How is all this related to the history of bystanding and the Holocaust? Allow me to begin my answer to this question with an anecdote. 2 weeks ago, I walked onto the campus of my home university, the University of Bielefeld. In front of the main building, I noticed 3 flags: the German flag on the left, the European flag on the right, and the Israeli flag in the center. I was astounded and admittedly also heartened by this sight. For some reason, I had not expected such a clear gesture of positioning at this time and place. But when I came closer, I saw that somebody had bespattered the Israeli flag with red paint, only the Israeli flag. When I reported the incident to the university, I was told that this was already the 2nd flag to be vandalized. They would check if this one could be cleaned, the first one couldn't, and just in case, they had already ordered 4 new flags. But this is only half of the anecdote. Since that day, I had several conversations with German colleagues here and there. We discussed events in the Middle East, of course, and also the heated protests in Germany and the US, specifically on university campuses. When I mentioned the flag incident, it was not the vandalism that caught these colleagues' attention. None of them expressed outrage or sadness about the red paint. Instead, they debated whether the Bielefeld Rectorate had been wise to raise an Israeli state symbol. Wasn't that rather inappropriate? Or shouldn't they at least have put up a Palestinian flag as well? Now, there are a number of ways in which this anecdote might be discussed. The main reason I brought it up is that it raises issues of positionality and of the need for situational and cultural context and process analysis, which are issues that are at the heart of the project I'm honored to direct with the support of Saul Friedländer's Balzan Prize. At the core of this project is the question how non-Jewish contemporaries responded to the persecution of the Jews in a European comparative perspective. The primary source base are contemporary ego documents, most importantly diaries, written by Jews and non-Jews during the Nazi era. What my team and I envision is a European social history of mass violence during Nazism. With its primary source base, mostly private, even intimate reflections on the events unfolding, the project approaches the history of genocide not primarily as a state or military crime, but as a gradual social and interpersonal process. Let me briefly outline the contours of the project before I will turn to my own research and discuss exemplarily 2 bystander diaries written in Nazi Germany and the Netherlands. As we all know, the mass murder of the European Jews was a social process driven by the Nazi regime and hundreds of thousands of German perpetrators. It was also facilitated by the active involvement of the non-Jewish majority populations within Germany and in the occupied territories. As Friedländer and others have shown, the role of so-called bystanders was crucial. Yet to this day, it remains as unclear as contested. After decades of scholarly focus first on the perpetrators and then on the victim's perspective, the role of bystanders remain to be explored systematically. Our project thus undertakes the first comprehensive analysis of the perceptions and actions of bystanders based on an exploration of published and unpublished diaries from the following countries: Germany, Austria, Poland, the Netherlands, Italy, France, Romania, Switzerland, Great Britain, and the United States. So that's a whole team of people behind that project, as you can imagine, but those are the countries we are able to cover at the moment. Diaries are among the most immediate textual manifestations of stigmatization and violence. We aim to collect several dozen Jewish and non-Jewish diaries from each country to analyze the role and responses of bystanders. But who are the bystanders? In the context of our project, we understand bystanders not as a fixed category or role. We rather prefer, actually, to speak of bystanding. It is a concept that serves as a heuristic device to explore the vast transnational social landscape in which the mass murder of the Jews unfolded as the result of millions of individual and collective acts of neglect, and as many ways of involvement. To grasp this vastness, we need to think of bystanding as an unstable subject position, a position that is dynamic, relational, and highly context-driven. In other words, people are never bystanders per se. They rather become bystanders to specific situations, sometimes knowingly and expectedly, more or less nearby or distant, sometimes without warning or out of sheer coincidence. Consequently, they respond in extremely varying ways, depending on a range of personal, situational, sociopolitical, and cultural factors. Bystanding, therefore, encompasses a wide spectrum of sentiments, perceptions, and actions, ranging from aversion and indifference to sympathy for the persecuted, and from active to passive participation in the persecution. This enormous historiographical and narrative challenge, namely to systematize these myriad ways and to contribute to an overall history of bystanding in the Shoah, is the goal we have set ourselves. The specific questions we want to answer are as follows. How did non-Jewish diaries address instances of stigmatization, persecution, and violence? How did Jewish diaries write about bystanders? What role did respective national contexts play, and aspects such as gender, class, religion, professional background, and political views? In which ways is anti-Semitism manifested in these accounts? Explicitly, but also in subtler ways, if we understand anti-Semitism with Shulamit Volkov and Peter Longridge as cultural code and a frame to view the world. We are interested in the specific semantic responses to the persecution in ego documents. What was the language of complicity in bystander diaries? And what was the language of bystanding in victims' diaries? And finally, how was bystanding addressed and remembered after the war in memory and public history contexts? Ultimately, I believe that the answers to these questions are not just relevant to Holocaust studies and education, but also to other contexts of genocidal and mass violence. This brings me to the second part of my lecture, in which I would like to talk about my own study. Its working title at the moment is Citizens in Genocide, Bystanding in the Holocaust in Germany and the Netherlands. For decades, we knew nothing of it, and there was nothing we could do, were typical representations of the self-perceptions of the non-Jewish majority populations in Germany and beyond. Historians have refuted these claims, pointing to evidence for a wide knowledge of and involvement in the Holocaust. Even if in the German case, we know a lot about the mobilizing forces of the idea of the Volksgemeinschaft, the people's community, the perceptions and actions within the general population remain understudied. The Netherlands, where 75% of the Jewish population were murdered, were seen by the Nazis as Germanic brother nation. The currently dominant narrative of the occupation is that the non-Jewish population largely consisted of hapless bystanders who were ignorant of the genocidal intentions of the Germans and thus lacked a sufficient sense of urgency to act on behalf of the victims. Had they known more, they would have done more, the argument goes. So, of course, we are faced with two extremely different overall contexts. Nazism was state policy in Germany since 1933. In the Netherlands, it was forcefully implemented through war and occupation. Still, a comparative perspective is possible if a fixed set of analytical questions is paired with careful contextualization and interpretation of the sources. To compare how perceptions of Jews were related to responses to the persecution and how Jews viewed the non-Jewish populations in both countries, I focus in my analysis on notions of community, citizenship, and compliance in the diaries of both groups. The aim is to identify specific experiences and encounters with persecution and violence, to differentiate emotional and cognitive responses, and to explore how these responses were tied to notions of personal status and responsibility vis-à-vis the state, society, and fellow citizens, or in fact, fellow human beings. To give you a glimpse into these sources and the potential of such an approach, let me now turn to my examples. The diaries of Friedrich Kellner and Adrianus Janus in the following Dirk Zwager, a German and a Dutchman who share a number of similarities. Both men can be considered ordinary men in the sense that they did not hold an office directly relevant to Nazi repression. Kellner was an outspoken critic of Nazism, and some scholars view his diary as an act of resistance. Both men, over decades, held positions within their country's legal system. Kellner as a trained clerk, Dirk Zwager as a studied jurist, who also worked in the Dutch colonies for 9 years. Their professional background seems particularly suited to explore issues of citizenship and compliance vis-à-vis a state and occupying power that, by legal and illegal means, sought to strip entire groups of their civil rights. I chose the excerpts from both men's diaries that I will discuss in the following according to a common logic. I quote from the very first entry of the diary, the first entry referring to anti-Jewish measures, and from the entry with the first substantial reference to the fate of the Jews. Friedrich Kellner was born in 1885 in Wahingen into a Protestant family. His father was a baker, and the family moved to Mainz, a city on the left side of the Rhine, when he was 4 years old. He trained as judicial clerk and worked as judicial officer as Justizinspektor at the district court in Mainz until 1933. Kellner fought in World War I and supported the Social Democrats during the Weimar years. In 1933, he left Mainz with his wife and their only son for fear of Nazi repressions, and he took on a job at the district court in Laubach near Gießen in the province of Hesse-Nassau. Throughout the 1930s, Kellner sought to convince friends, colleagues, and acquaintances, mostly in private conversations, of the cruelty and fallacy of Nazism. In 1938, after Germany had annexed Austria and Hitler's standing had reached a high, Kellner felt prompted to start a diary. He did so in part because he felt he needed to be more cautious about voicing critical views of the regime, and in part because he sought to record what was really going on in this country for the future. These were certainly no heroic times as the Nazis propagated, he wrote. 2 weeks after what would be the last Nuremberg rally in early September 1938, Kellner began his diary on September 26th with the following words. The meaning of my writing is to record momentary impressions of the mood in my surroundings so that a later time won't be tempted to present it as a grandiose event. Above all, there's no excitement at all. All people hope, believe in miracles, and create a worldview in their little heads that has nothing to do with foresight whatsoever. He who wants to get to know contemporary society, the souls of the good Germans, may read my notes. But I fear after the events are over, only few decent people will be left, and the guilty won't have any interest to see their humiliation recorded. End quote. More than a year later, in mid-October 1939, Kellner explicitly mentions Jews for the first time. Most likely, any notes he had made in between since September 1938 are lost. So on October 10th, 1939, he wrote, quote, "To avoid that the rage of the people is not directed towards its own suppressors, rulers have understood it at all times to conceal their own guilt through distractive maneuvers. Thus, the whole Jew action, Judenaktion, was nothing else than what a piece of thrown meat means to beasts. The Jews are our misfortune, the Nazis yell. The right answer of the people would have been, no, not the Jews, but the Nazis are the misfortune of the German people. The lack of goodwill on our side, and by that he refers to the Nazi regime, our side, is plainly to be seen from the entire propaganda. We have let no opportunity pass to hit at the English in a cat-like manner. Let me just mention Palestine. We throw the Jews out of Germany, and simultaneously we instigate the Arabs by word and text so that they resist Jewish settlements. Is that a consequential policy? Only the delusional idea to cause trouble for the English wherever possible and cheer about it can lead us to such a nonsensical attitude. Extremely clumsy is everything we have managed to do since 1933. 3 days later, on October 13th, 1939, Kellner returns to the fate of the Jews. In the first longer passage on the issue in his diary, he addressed the Judenfrage in context of Germany's decline into lawlessness since the Nazi takeover. Quote, "Any Volksgemeinschaft, the state, has to lead by example, of course. He has to guarantee the basic rights of his citizens. These have to be sanctified rights for eternity. How is the situation in this regard today in Germany? Miserable. A folk without constitution, a slave folk. When will Germany revive? I don't dare yet to imagine the events that are still to come. Too many problems have been taken up in the past 6 years, but not a single one has been solved. They tried to solve the Judenfrage with brutal one-sidedness, in a rigorous way. But the Nazis have not thought about where the Jews shall live. That they leave generously to the other states. The Jew is being plundered according to the rules of a band of robbers, and then he can go. Not even with the gypsies they proceeded like that. They at least were allocated fixed places. From the standpoint of an orderly state, from a Staatswesen, nothing can be said against that. But when the Jews, who over centuries have clearly contributed achievements in the economic life to the broader development of this country, if they are stripped of their rights, then this is a deed unworthy of a Kulturnation, a cultured nation." End quote. Let me now turn to the Dutch example, the diary of Janos Dirkswager. Dirkswager was born in 1888. He was 3 years younger than Kellner. After getting a PhD in law from Leiden University in 1913, he worked as an attorney first in Rotterdam and from 1915 to 1924 in the Dutch Indies. He married in 1921 and the couple had 3 kids. When he returned to Rotterdam, Dirkswager was a respected lawyer and businessman. And in 1927, he became a judge at the criminal court in Rotterdam. When Nazi Germany invaded the Netherlands in May of 1940, Dirk Zwager and his family lived through the bombing of Rotterdam. He began his diary 6 days after the invasion. The first entry begins as follows. Today is Thursday, May 16, 1940. On May 15, the Netherlands had to hand itself over to Germany, and I shall strive to describe the events of the last days as good as possible. Witnessing together with my neighbors how German planes filled the night sky on May 10th, we all assumed that now finally Germany had undertaken the great attack against England. Indeed, with this, the neutrality of the Netherlands was being violated in the most serious way, but people did not immediately realize that thereby the Netherlands too had entered the war. At 5 o'clock in the morning, suddenly, large German waterplanes approached from the direction of the city. Then it became clear that we too would have to endure an attack by Germany. We were thus in war. End quote. The first time Dirk Zwager mentions anti-Jewish measures was in late May of 1940, only a few days later. As exemplified by the following passage, he often jumped from one topic to another without transitions. The couple had just bought a country house in a town called Heeg. Quote, Wednesday, a telegram from Heeg bought that house for 650 gulden. I'm curious when I will be allowed to look at this property. Called together the colleagues of my coffee club for next Tuesday at the Atlantic House on West Plain. Marx and Franken, our Jewish judges, removed from the prominent posts and placed in the anonymity of a civil court, Zivile Kammer. I agree with this measure. I am astonished still about the little insight that many have, in my view, into the current state of affairs. On Wednesday, German Reich Commissioner Seyss-Inquart held his throne speech in The Hague, mostly to talk about the judicial power, to not let anyone doubt the binding character of the decrees passed and to be passed by the sitting government. May the Dutch High Court understand this hint and not start declare all kinds of regulations as non-binding. I foresee that many of us will become superfluous. End of quote. Dirk Zwager usually spent no more than 2 or 3 sentences on the fate of the Jews. In the following entry, written a year after the German invasion of May 10th, 1941, he summarized how views of the Germans had changed and concluded that Nazi policies, including anti-Jewish policies, had thus far failed. Quote, what has changed is our insight regarding the Germans and their National Socialism. Where on May 40th, 1940, there was a strong antipathy against the English in this country, this has changed completely. The Germans did not have the gift to exploit the mood. To the contrary, they did everything to alienate us from them. Thus, there's no single Dutchman who is impressed by the Germans or follows them. Everything that belongs to the Dutch NSB, the Dutch Nazi Party, has to be counted as losers who have failed in normal society. Thus, one can easily say that all they try to get going in this country has failed miserably. Winter help, the guilds, press regulation, Kraft durch Freude, persecution of the Jews, in brackets, from our Jews you stay away. Nothing of it has worked, end quote. Let me conclude by relating the excerpts from Kellner's and Dirk Zwager's diaries to some of the questions outlined earlier. Both men were sympathetic bystanders who were acutely aware of and overall critical of anti-Jewish measures. That makes their diaries particularly relevant because we can probe in which ways their sympathies actually mattered, how they shaped the daily perception and behavior towards Jews. At the same time, both regarded the Jews as clearly separate from their respective societies. Kellner, for example, questioned the way the so-called Judenfrage, the Jewish question, was handled, but not the very premise that there was such a thing as a Jewish question. He valued stately order and the notion of our Volksgemeinschaft, people's community, just not the order and community envisioned and practiced by the Nazis. He rejected the persecution of Jews out of a sense of compassion, but even more so from a standpoint of cultural superiority, constantly weighing the decent Kulturnation against the stupid, brainwashed German folk. And his notes indicate a usability calculus. The Jews had contributed to the economic development of Germany, therefore they should be left alone. Kellner did emphasize with their fate and later noted repeatedly what he had heard of mass crimes. Occasionally, he was a judicial clerk after all, he even pondered the treatment of Jews as a violation of their civic and human rights. Janusz Dirk-Schwacher shared a number of sentiments and convictions with Kellner. He took note of the steps taken against Jews. He also considered them quasi-naturally to be a separate group within his imagined national community. He said, our Jews, right? He agreed with the very first discriminatory measure he witnessed up close, the relegation of two colleagues, without feeling the need to say a single word about why he was in accordance with it. He too was worried about and felt responsible for stately order and the rule of law, even if by Nazi law. And taking stock after a year of the occupation, he concluded that the Germans had failed to persecute the Dutch Jews, even though he had recorded a number of anti-Jewish measures in his diary over the previous months. The tone and languages of both diaries, and this is my last thought, is marked by indignation, sadness, mockery, sarcasm, compassion, and shame, but also elitism and a strong sense of a beleaguered actual German, actual Dutch decency. Perhaps not unlike the way Thomas Mann looked at Germany and the Germans from his faraway exile. They also shared a strong sense of responsibility and professional availability, a willingness to serve the common good of the nation once the Nazi nightmare was over. Still, the degree to which Thomas Mann expressed interest in and solidarity with the Jews was exceptional. In a way, he was one of the time's most idiosyncratic sympathetic bystanders. And as the work of Saul Friedländer and many others suggests, more solidarity, even the private and hardly unconditional solidarity of the sort Friedrich Kellner and Janusz Dirk-Schwacher expressed in their diaries, would have made a difference during the Holocaust. There lies a lesson for our time. And hopefully, as we keep studying this catastrophic history, its lessons will continue to resonate in the future. Thank you for your attention.
Dear Professor Morina, dear Christina, your words at the beginning of your lecture moved me very much, of course. And what you said about blowing up of anti-Semitism, I know that very well, but I nonetheless was shocked by it and puzzled by the sudden and widespread of the flames, of what you mentioned. I won't go into that topic. That would be quite another runde. Let me just say that I admire what you said and did at Bielefeld for the flags, and I share your astonishment. Now to your lecture on our topic, the bystanders. I must say I admire your courage to take on this topic. It's maybe one of the most difficult to grasp topics of the history of the Holocaust, because if you think of it, and you said it in a way, the bystanders were most Europeans, not to speak of some Americans, but I would prefer to keep to Europe, occupied Europe, Nazi Europe, and so on. The bystanders were millions. The way you go at it, that is analyzing their diaries and the diaries of the victims who look at them, they are an infinitesimal part of the bystanders. I mean, everybody practically was a bystander, millions and millions, and the diarists are a few hundreds if you manage to get them together. Now, that's not the main difficulty. I'm sorry to speak of the difficulties, but it's the heart of the topic. The difficulty is that you take two categories of diaries, the victims looking at the bystander and trying to figure out their motivations, right? And the bystanders writing on their own motivations in their diaries. Now, the victims will not write very much. As far as I vaguely remember, I lost part of my memory, but still vaguely remember the history of the Holocaust. The victims had their life to think of and their death. And they noted what the bystanders said or did, but as facts. In Victor Klemperer's diary, you will find him telling about that this lady told him that she said hello when the Jewish star was put on, and that many of the people he knew had encountered the same events, that is, being greeted, but you don't know anything about the motivations of those who greeted. You know that happened. That's very touching and very important, but it doesn't say much about the bystanders. And that's the view of a victim, potential victim. He escaped, Klemperer. But if you take somebody who was much more and he lived in Dresden, if you take somebody which was much more present at the beginning and the course of what became the Holocaust, Zygmunt Klukowski, a doctor, a Polish doctor, I think I didn't go and check that, but I have the feeling from what I remember that he noted the sufferings of the Jews with great sympathy. That's in a way similar to, well, let's say to Kellner and to the Dutchman as well. He went to Warsaw, he saw the ghetto from the outside, he described it, and so on. But again, he was not an introspective type. So the problem is how to get from these elements of sympathy which existed and which the victims noted. That's all true, and certainly all to be thought of, but it doesn't give you the elements of the bystanding. That is what really pushed some people to do this or that for the victims, or to write about the victimization and so on. So I see that as a huge problem, but I admire again you know all that. I mean, this is nothing new that I'm telling you. And you are taking on a very, in my opinion, extremely difficult topic, and for that, congratulations.
Well, thank you so much for these rich reflections. I feel like we can jump right into a discussion at this point, and I also wanted to encourage you, after my pleasure of sort of jump-starting our conversation, I wanted to invite you as well to raise questions to our speakers. But maybe the first question can go to you once again. I mean, the legacy of this wonderful Balzan Prize and its impact.
No, that is not asking.
I'll get to him. I'll get to him as well, yes. Just to sort of continue picking up on where you've left off.
Yeah.
I mean, what you've just described, shows the important legacy of your work and the international collaborative work that can now begin on the basis of your prize at an international level. And I wonder whether you could tell us a little bit about the kind of legacy that you envision with the work that Christina is sort of spearheading at this point, the culmination of your scholarship leading up to the prize and its impact it's going to have for the future, a new generation of Holocaust study scholars and students.
I must think of this. I really have no answer. But next meeting, okay. I will have an answer prepared.
I thought I was starting easy. Well, anyway, thank you. Yes. So, I mean, you have touched upon so many wonderful points that I thought, were also very valuable for us to pick up. Maybe the first question can go to any of you, and that really has to do with this key term, bystanding. And Christina, you have pointed out in very persuasive ways that you want to move away from the notion of the bystander, the person, and shift our focus to the action itself, bystanding. And I wonder whether you could say a little bit more about your decision to move in that direction. I would also like to invite Norbert to jump in. And at the same time, sort of help us, since we are bilingual in this kind of conversation, to think a little bit about the translational difference between bystanding and in the German equivalent Mitläufertum. So bystanding, obviously, we sort of hear the connotation of a verb, of an action, that is actually an inaction, it's passivity. You're not doing anything, but you're standing. Whereas in the German term, Mitläufertum, there is actually a certain action involved. It's just that you are walking or running, doing things with others. So I wonder whether you could also sort of say a few more words about that kind of a translational difference. This is also another easy question.
Well, I mean, no, I don't want to take it from you, but actually, what David just mentioned, the difference between bystanding and Mitläufertum is the equivalent, is a rather important one, because the whole notion of Mitläufer is something which comes in the view only after the deed, so to speak. It comes with the denazification processes. It comes with the Allies confronting the Germans. It's part of the confrontational politics of the Allies towards the Germans. And also it's part of a reaction towards their reaction, because the reaction of the Germans in the spring of 1945 is what almost everyone who intruded Germany, who achieved it, who reached Germany from outside, noticed in the first moment. Nobody wanted to be a Nazi. So this kind of reaction was later on framed, well, they all pretend to have been nothing more but a Mitläufer. And this kind of Mitläufertum then is also one of the categories of the massive and mass bureaucratical process of what was called denazification. And there's even the notion of, or there's even a caricature where all these brown sheeps, the Nazis, walk and then they arrive at the denazification machinery, and at the end of the process, through this machinery, they come out of the machinery as white sheeps. So denazification as a process which produces exonerated at best, or this vast majority of Mitläufer. And then this notion of Mitläufer is a rather apologetic notion. I mean, it's an excuse. Well, yes, we were living through these times, but we were only Mitläufer. And this is why I consider the term Mitläufer actually in the field which Tina and her team are now considering and researching actually worthless. I mean, it's much better to stay even in German with this concept of bystanding instead of reanimate, so to speak, the idea of Mitläufertum. I leave it to that for the moment.
May I add a few, and maybe I try to also come back to your initial questions. And thank you for the comments. And this very short conversation already about the term bystander or bystanding and Mitläufer shows that language is, on the one hand, all we have as historians in a way to express what we are doing. But it's also something that is almost inescapably loaded with, with a history. Even the term bystander, of course, has a history, has a different meaning in different fields. It means something different in American psychology and something different in Austrian philosophy. And if you translate it into Zuschauer, onlooker, or witness, Zeuge, and we published actually an essay on all the different ways in which the bystander is named in different languages, Polish, you name it, French. It's fascinating because it carries so much of the history we're actually dealing with. So one of the goals of the project actually is to look for a new vocabulary, to reflect deeply on the language we speak, we as historians, our analytical terms that we use. And if we mean that the Holocaust was a social process, which is one of the concepts in recent years, right, then we have to have a vocabulary that is referring to processes, not to static moments. And of course, all of us people, humans are not static. And the roles humans play and the behavior they do, how they behave, changes over time. So it is a push, in a way, by picking up the term so, courageously or stupidly, however you want to put it, we actually want to problematize it in productive ways. And the second main task I see for ourselves is to study closely the contemporary language of persecution, to go back to how contemporaries actually talked about what they saw. And of course, nobody would write, oh, I had an encounter today with a bystander. You won't find that in a diary. People talk, the Dutch, for instance, talk a lot about non-Jews, the Nicht-Joden, the Christians, the Dutch, even though, right? And how Dutch non-Jews talked about their Jews, as Dirk Zwager phrased it, right, is fascinating. We don't know that. So in coming back briefly to the big question, and of course it's all justified. It's a huge challenge. I think I want to move away from trying to discern what people's motivations were. I think you have the feeling that if you read a diary, you really come close to a person. You even enter their minds, their hearts, because diaries are fascinating documents, right? But even living human beings, we are unable to look into each other's psyche. So in a way, what we want to do is we are less courageous. We just say, look at what people wrote. What is the language they used for their experiences, for their feelings? So I was not talking, I think, once about motivations in my talk. I talked about responses, reflections, reactions maybe, and we also, we have to have corroborative evidence if we want to. In order to find out what actually Dirk Zwager's sympathy meant in reality, I would have to study, and we will look at other documents, we will have to study how he behaved, right? About Kellner, much is known, it's a prominent published diary by now, but there's no research on that question. What did actually his sympathy entail in real life in terms of, well, we know a little bit about that he actually tried to help very actively Jewish friends, but also people he didn't know. Yeah.
Wonderful. I mean, this is such a wonderful masterclass in Holocaust studies. So, I hope that you're also appreciating our conversation as much as I am. I think, one of the lessons that I gained from listening to all of you is the wide range of attitudes, actions, inactions that and feelings that are captured in this very difficult and arguably untranslatable or untranslated term bystanding. And I'd like to sort of go back to what Saul has raised, and that is the difficulty of working with human sympathy and translating such an affective response feeling into a verifiable, scholarly verifiable, cross-checkable parameter of figuring out what bystanding means. So I guess my one way of phrasing this question would be, obviously, it seems to me that adjectives like active and passive are no longer sufficient to understand the wide scope of possibilities. So what are other ways of, what are some words that you have already found in these various diaries that seem to sort of get at this possible range, other than, let's say, active or passive or silence or speaking up, doing something, not doing something? What is some language of this gray zone that you have already encountered?
Well, the way we look at it, or I look at it, is not that I try to read bystander diaries in order to find out what bystanders wrote about their own actions. I think the mutual perspective is productive. And then there's what I call the language of complicity in bystander diaries, even though I don't believe that all bystanders are by definition guilty or not guilty. And I don't agree that bystanding means you do nothing. Doing nothing is also doing something. So that is to your point that active and passive is actually useless, right? But a typical bystander word for me in a way is, for instance, the word schrecklich, right? In German, terrible. But that's, of course, then the whole, the art of hermeneutics, that you have to make an argument that this passage in a diary, where supposedly the person expresses sympathy, is actually quite hollow, and he's not sympathetic, right? He says, oh, it's terrible what happens to the Jews out there, and then I had coffee with my friend, right? So the way so the context of the diary, not only the context of the person, but also the context of a specific word or sentence is very important. And then I think this is an example. And in the Dutch language, for instance, the whole history and memory debate about the guilt of the Dutch majority or the general population in the high rate of death among Dutch Jews, one of the central words couples is actually goed and fout, good and evil, right? And that's a contemporary word, right? That's what people used when they describe in a diary, oh, I had this encounter on a train, a Jewish person was made to stand up, and the guy who made him was a Faut. You could really see that, right? So he was just wrong. Wrong is the literal translation, falsch. And that's actually a term that made it, until the present, into the popular, very difficult debate the Dutch society still has about these events. And that has changed in recent years with a book on diaries that actually is the very heart of where this project started, a Dutch controversy about a book that argued, well, the non-Jewish population didn't really know what would happen in the East. Had they known, they would have done more. And that's a very apologetic argument that had a lot of traction in the Netherlands, and so that was the original impulse also for taking it up and appreciating what diaries actually can tell us, but just do it in a different way, not using diaries like that. Also, the Jewish perspective as kind of a checking perspective, because he would argue, if the Jews who, were the victims, obviously, didn't go all into hiding when they could, if they didn't know, how would you expect that the non-Jews would know how dangerous this is? And so he made an argument, this book made an argument that kind of used the Jewish experience to to apologize the Dutch non-Jewish population. So this is still ongoing, and my answer is blurry a little bit, but it's about terms that it's about seeking out terms that we are not used to anymore, because we of course have a Holocaust language of our own. We are all culturally informed in one way or another by a certain semantics about when we talk about the Holocaust, and it's interesting to irritate that and look at these the contemporary discourse in that way.
Brief methodological remark, taking on a bit on what Saul said about diaries. We, of course, talked about this already, but not all of you are part of our conversation we had, and we tried to do something here also in a way, as David said, like a master class. I mean, the diaries do have this element of self-justification. I mean, at the end of the day, I write about what I saw, what I experienced during the day, and I also make already some sort of sense of the day. And this is almost automatically that it comes with a certain apologetic moment. Even if you don't really understand what you saw, what had happened, if you haven't yet made up your mind about it, you tend to excuse yourself for not having intervened, probably. You tend to explain to yourself how you behaved, if it's a rather reflective diary. Or in this Kellner diary, there were these elements of an almost didactical approach for a future after this terrible Nazi regime, which he, as a social democrat, hates to the bone. And he comes up with elements of reasoning which later on you could really experience in the late 1940s, when Kurt Schumacher, the leading social democrat, basically argued in his first speech, referring to the fate of the Jews in the Deutsche Bundestag, in the German parliament, by saying, we lost such a valuable part of our population. This was a criteria for social democrats. And of course, he meant that this was an absolute crime, but he thought that he would need to put it in this kind of usefulness framework, yeah? And what the Germans did to themselves. This was also a period of German reasoning after the deed. The other one, which is prominent at that time, is highly contested by most of the Germans when the first federal president, Theodor Heuss, says, "Wir haben von den Dingen gewusst." We did know about the things. And he immediately gets a lot of reaction by his fellow Germans. Well, Mr. Heuss, you might have known. I didn't know about Bergen-Belsen until this event in 1952 when you opened the dedication of the memorial. Yeah. So this kind of you find already elements of post-war reasoning in the moment when you read diaries of the late 1930s or early 40s. Yeah, and this is also striking, I think.
Yeah, I completely agreed. And I think when you referred to the diary as an ego document, I thought that was one of those moments where one could also really have a wonderful conversation about what that meant, the self-referential representation, which is in many ways flawed and embellished and so forth and so forth. I could ask a million more questions, but I want to respect your presence and your curiosity and all the things that are on your mind. So I'd like to open up the floor now to questions from the audience.
I enjoyed this talk very much. I do like the thinking about the different terminology about bystanding and bystander and all of that. I very much appreciate that. I obviously grew up in Germany and had a father who was fighting for Hitler, and it was the issue, what did you do when you saw the first thing coming up? Not when it came later and you had to say, I didn't know, but when you saw how people were treating Jews. You know, the very first time you saw a yellow star, what did you do? And I think that is a normal question any child would ask their parent. And so I like to go to where we live in this country right now and in general. What do we do actually when we see so much injustice going by? Where do we stand up and what do we do? And I think that the children of the children of the people who are in power right now will ask exactly that question. And I would like to have more communication around that. Because unfortunately, you learn that everything goes back to the own West, right? If it comes not back to you, you don't do anything. And that's what we also saw. People were not brave. That's what I've always heard. I mean, and if I hear, I'm sorry, I'm going now into American politics too. If I hear that that some people have to buy protection because they speak up against regimes in general in America, I can only say we all know where it goes when not everyone speaks up. Because then you suddenly have to be brave and you have to be a hero, and not so many people are heroes. So I very much appreciate this bystanding communication. I guess it wasn't a question. I'm sorry.
Still, I would like to respond because I'm grateful that you bring up the issue of public history and education, because what you're actually talking about is, if you talk to us as historians, all we can do is think about how is this relevant to the present, right? So, and one thing I noticed in dealing with also with the question, if you go into a museum, how is the general population or the non-Jews or the bystanders actually being represented there, right? One thing you notice is exactly that what you just reflected, focus on people's individual courage, right? The notion that we all have to be civic and there has to be civil courage and we have to speak up is infusing all of what we teach our children and what we see in our museums, and it's very important. I want to say that, but it also it has led to a tendency to don't ask anymore about conditions and context and the conditions under which certain behaviors, certain attitudes grow, and under which they don't. And what are the measures, what are the institutions, what are the processes that lead to certain human behaviors to, being on the rise and also receding? Also, how do societies, how do state institutions actually, as all of which, frame and deeply influence how we behave as human beings, shape what we do? And I think we should ask more, I don't have these answers for the present, because I don't think the answers, I don't think that the answer lies in Appellen, sozusagen appellieren, appeal to people's individual courage, because I sympathize with bystanders who feel themselves to be absolutely powerless. There are many situations in which, you can feel completely powerless. And the more important, I think, is the focus on institutions, on what makes a good democratic state, what makes a society less unequal, how do certain minorities come to be minorities in the first place? And that goes back to your comment. Of course, there are cultural, cultural mentalities, beliefs, imaginations. And anti-Semitism is the most brutal form of it, that we as societies carry throughout history, and who have great bearing. And the question is, what conditions brings this out, and what are the conditions under which we've seen it, recede? And I think it would be wise to move away a little bit from the bystander or the individual is responsible, which is important in itself, but I think the context and the conditions should be looked at more intensely.
So sitting in this room, in this house, and talking about diaries, I can't help thinking about the former owner of the house who wrote a diary almost every day and frequently talked about what was going on in the world, including back in Germany. And so my question is, how unusual are those type of diaries, right? You're collecting diaries that talk about the subject that you're interested in, but what percentage of diaries did mention what was going on with the Jews, right? And how many diaries are just about their love life, or like Thomas Mann's? You say that some diaries, they skip around, and that tells you something. I mean, Thomas Mann also says, I went walking on the beach, I went to Westwood for a haircut, submarine sunk a ship, right? And that's the end of the entry. So how unusual, and are you comparing the diaries that you find to many other ones that aren't necessarily part of the project?
So I try to be very brief. Every diary is unique. So I cannot tell you in which way is unusual or not, because every diary is unique. The second, I don't study only the diaries that the archivist tells me talks a little bit about the Jewish persecution or something, like keywords or indexed. I'm particularly interested in those we do not deem relevant, because it's a wedding diary of a couple that starts in 1928 and goes until 1935, and you have the feeling 1933 doesn't happen. And still, I'm particularly interested in those, because still, things where we know what went on. So to a specific look at those where it's not the primary intention of the writer to document what's happening, but where they refer to it in passing, because you find, of course, that the persecution and the violence is present, and the art, I think, is, or the challenge is to find in which way it is present. And a last comment, I think, that goes back to your question at the beginning, because it's such a tiny, it's a tiny sample and testament of a huge social environment. many diarists talk about huge social groups and communities. They don't, of course, they talk about themselves and their, the way you describe it, but they talk about what friends say, what they read in the papers. So you have an idea about the public opinion that, or the published opinion. So in fact, I think diaries would be underrated, or we would underestimate their value if we only consider them individual ego documents. They're social ego documents. So they tell you something about, for instance, the cultural tenets, people talk about in their cultures in certain ways, and that is reflected in diaries. So they, even if we only have 50, it aims, find 50 Jewish diaries in Poland or in these places where so much human destruction was produced that all physical evidence is gone, is a great challenge, but still. And then you also you only have a certain strata of society that tends to write diaries. Of course, we take that into account, that it's important, but still a diary also talks about the maid, or the farmer's market, what people talked about with people who did not write diaries. So you actually, it's like a window in a way. I'd like to think about it as windows into the internal, but also the external landscape of the diarist.
The subject of bystander, I think, was, discussed in a book in the 1980s by Daniel Goldhagen, and it was called Hitler's Willing Executioner.
90s.
90s, yeah. Anyway, but that seems to be a much more, active, the bystander played a much more active role than the word bystander would imply, I think. And if you look at diaries, that's already, as the professor mentioned, is already an act of reflection, and therefore maybe what you then get an understanding is what people that write diaries expressed, but that may not be a typical bystander, and a willing executioner is certainly a very active role where you are full of anti-Semitism and just have now a chance to act on it. And if you look at the pogroms, I think there was more than just bystanding, because as a bystander in Germany would be also Zuschauer, you were actually kind of contributing it and took part in it. And I think, how would your research relate to that kind of concept?
Since you mentioned also your response, I thought, well, that's a very good point. That's another methodological problem, of course. But there are killers who write diaries as well. So, there's Alfred Rosenberg, there are prominent ones. The Goebbels diary, of course, they write diaries for various reasons, and also their diaries are unique, right? So, it's a very interesting question once we decide that we do need categories, and we categorize a diary as not a perpetrator but a bystander diary. It's precisely the question that you raise that we need to answer at the very end. What makes a bystander diary a bystander diary? How do you, because we want to at the end not just tell stories about stories, we want to systematize a little bit and gain some systematic insight. So that's it's a very preliminary answer to the question you raised, the problem raised. But you also it's not victims write, rescuers write, helpers write, perpetrators write diaries. So more dramatic, I find the social class limitation on the cultural practice of writing a diary. That might be more dramatic even than the one that you measure by the degree of involvement in the crimes.
Yeah. So I have a question that really applies more to the modern day and in the globalized society we live in now, where you have things like social media, the internet, driving news channels and information. I'm curious where you draw the line in terms of being a bystander. And one prominent event right now is what's going on in Israel. And I think some people feel very inclined to take a very strong stance, post a lot on social media about it, but I think others might be more hesitant because they feel like they don't have incomplete information. So I'm curious what you all think about that.
It's a real tough question, but if we say, or I don't think that we can avoid being a bystander on the occurrences of our days. And probably there's also an interesting factor here with regard to the evolvement or development of the public and the media. I mean, when Friedrich Kellner wrote his diary, he basically, and actually he cutted newspapers, the Völkische Beobachter as the Nazi official paper, and probably one or two regional papers which also were writing and printing along the lines of the Nazi party. So his options were rather limited. He could hear some foreign radio if he risks a certain punishment, but that was basically it. And he could hear what soldiers coming from the front would say. I mean, I remember our astonishment years ago, Saul, when we realized when as early people in the westernmost part of the Münsterland came across very concrete information about the gassing system in Auschwitz and things like that. So, yes, but this kind of media scene, if I may say so, is completely different from what we have nowadays, and where every one of us is also not a recipient only, but also a sender, and a person who produces information or disinformation. And still, I mean, most of us are, in this respect, more or less helpless bystanders, but not unknowing bystanders. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for raising that question. I think it's an incredibly urgent one. And since I've recently finished working on Arendt, there is an interesting way of thinking with her and a little bit against her. And the example that she uses is something that I think is not irrelevant for us. So the context in which she thinks about the ways in which we are in many ways implicated in what's happening elsewhere around the world is actually the availability of nuclear weapons during the Cold War. She says that the kind of destruction that a nuclear war can cause can technically impact every human being on Earth, which had not been the case before. When wars happen, when military conflict happens between nations, those are the peoples affected. But with a nuclear war, you can really have the entire globe perish at some point. And that creates a huge moral problem for the entirety of humanity. Now, based on that observation, Arendt says, what do you do? Because this is also the question that we have with social media. When we are implicated, by things that are happening around the globe, what do we do as subjects who feel in many ways helpless and ineffective? And Arendt's solution is political action can only happen not only between human beings, between individuals, because what you do as an individual can really have a little impact in many ways, but you have the most impact at a local level. So political action across oceans is in many ways meaningless. So you can have students protest in 1968 against the Vietnam War, but they don't understand the culpability of their own government in the Vietnam War. So why don't they protest against the kind of involvement of the American government in the Vietnam War as opposed to just protesting against the Viet Cong? So that kind of a local specificity is absolutely important for Arendt, and I think in many ways it addresses your question as well, right? Because in the United States, for Arendt, civil disobedience was a constitutional right that was obviously not available in Nazi Germany. And so for Arendt then in Nazi Germany, the way in which you stood by without being complicit was by retreating to your private self and think critically with your own self and not abet a crime. And so there, the ego document is actually a conversation with your own self and not necessarily in relation to victims. But there is sort of a dialogue that's possible there.
Any concluding remarks from the panelists? Thank you very much. And please, let's continue the conversations.